All right, thanking and praising God for the way in which, whether or not we are aware of it, there are times when he prepares us for great things. And in this chapter where his disciples are about to be sent out on a great mission, let's call Mark chapter 6, great mission. Understand that I spent too much time in the last lesson calling chapter 5, chapter 6. Anyway, all that aside, we are actually in chapter 6 right now. And one of the reasons why I want to call this the Great Mission is not so much because it literally comes up in the chapter, but Mark is another one of the Gospels that is similar in its ending to Matthew, which ends with what we call the Great Commission. There is an additional section that is not in every manuscript that happens at the end of what we have now as the standard text of the Bible that gives a similar commission regarding the mission ahead for his apostles after his death and departure to be with the Father. But now in chapter 6, we're getting a preview of that. This is maybe their first run at independence before he leaves them. And so let's look at it from the perspective of the great mission in this chapter that, as we mentioned in ending or describing chapter 5, this chapter starts with his rejection back in his hometown, understanding that the great wisdom that he taught with and the great works that he was doing actually caused others, or those maybe too many in his hometown, if not everyone, to be offended, understanding that the thing that underlay his wisdom and his works wasn't vainglory, but it was his kindness. And his kindness, basic kindness, was what ended up providing the offense in verses 1 through 6, describing his return to his hometown. That whole concept of basic things being offensive is going to carry through a good half of the chapter, as in the next section, he is going to describe sending out the apostles and the instructions with which he sends them in verses 7 through 13, where there's going to be an important instruction where since we've seen these things before in Matthew, and some of them we will see again in Luke, I want to highlight the differences probably to what I have mentioned already. And the thing that caught my attention this time was, even though I mentioned shaking the dust off of your feet in the same description given in Matthew, this time it caught my attention that that whole concept of shaking the dust off of your feet is a very important tool for maintaining your peace of mind. And we'll come back to that as we continue with the chapter description, where in verses 14 through 29, it's going to describe the death of John the Baptist, who is going to be beheaded, as we saw in Matthew. But the thing that caught my attention this time was the way in which we talked about basic things can cause friction. Basic truth got him in trouble, where we see in verse 18, for John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And that whole have concept is made clear in Mark's description of John's death, because backing up to verse 17, it's going to say, for it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. It just seems basic. Even in our culture, there's probably a lot more open, I guess I call it, to what is and is not marriage. That two brothers married to the same woman is still odd even by our standards. And accordingly, that's just basic truth that's getting John in trouble. And ultimately, it's what gets him killed, even though one of the things that also stands out as distinct to me in Mark's description of John's ultimate death is the way that Herod actually tried to protect him. So even beyond being reluctant and afraid of the crowds, it seems that in verse 20, it's going to say, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed and yet heard him gladly. And so it seems to go beyond mere fear for Mark to let us know that Herod might have had some affection for him. Bottom line is it literally says he tried to protect him, but he got into a situation where he made a rash vow, one that reminds me of King Artaxerxes in the book of Esther going too far during a party that he threw, trying to call his wife in to parade her around, trying to impress his friends at a time when she was not in the mood. That actually opened the door for Queen Esther, or Esther, to become queen, because it basically set him on a path where he probably didn't want to put away the queen at that time, but because he was trying to impress his friends, he kind of had worked himself into a bind. And even worse than that, after Esther was made queen. He allowed himself drinking with one of his buddies, Haman, to agree to allow Haman to have way too much influence over an entire group of people, the Jewish people who turned out to be actually the people of Queen Esther. And so, as we have seen in the Old Covenant, we get a fresh example here in Mark chapter 6 of a ruler being way too casual around folks of suspect character, which ultimately is going to cost him the life of someone he not only considers righteous, but someone he actually seems to respect. And even beyond that, in losing that individual, he is actually going to incur blood guilt, as the chapter is going to go on to in a similar fashion to what we saw in Matthew 14. And if I didn't already mention it, this is another chapter that seems to bear not so much a one-to-one correlation, but it roughly follows the pattern of Matthew 14, understanding that Jesus sending out the 12 in Matthew's gospel happens quite a bit before in Matthew 10. Conceptually here, the way it's organized, it still brings an important point out that I think we'll get to if I can get through the summary. But Matthew 14 seems to be where there is likewise a similar transition between the death of John and what we'll see next, the feeding of the 5,000 here in Mark chapter 6, where he's going to say that the apostles returned to Jesus and told them all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, going back to that theme that we saw before of the great crowds. The thing that I thought was really cool and I guess inspired the introduction that I used this time was Jesus was not just doing impressive things for himself. He had a larger purpose. He was moving beyond Israel, eventually to try to reach the whole world and reconcile us all to the Christ. And in a lot of ways, that starts with this great mission, because the crowds that began to form around Jesus are now going to seem to be influenced by the work of his apostles, understanding that they are now facing the kind of following, even though it's really Jesus' following, they are spreading the kindness to the degree that they are now amassing crowds as well, to the point where Jesus is saying that they need to rest, as it's going to go on to say, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. As that sets the context for the fact that even though what seemed to be more emphasized in Matthew's gospel was this withdrawal was one that Jesus had originally kind of planned for himself, or seemed to take on his own, understanding that he had gotten news of John's death and quite possibly needed some time to at least reflect and pray and possibly even mourn a little bit for John. This time, we're getting to see him look out for the needs of his apostles as well, even though their chance to rest is likewise going to be interrupted by the crowds, that they aren't going to turn away. In contrast, or actually to the contrary, he is actually going to continue healing them and have compassion for them even beyond the healing that they're getting, to see that they really don't have a lot to eat, even though they are out in a desolate place, something that we saw in Matthew 14. But Mark's description seems to give us additional insight into the need for rest that not only Jesus seemed to have, but likewise the apostles seemed to have. And in that context, them putting themselves in a position where they were willing to delay their rest just a little bit longer to show compassion to the crowds. Understanding that he is then going to send them ahead, as we saw in Matthew's description, to get an opportunity to finally take his break, as he sends the apostles ahead on the sea to a town called Bethsaida, introducing the famous story of Jesus walking on the water. One thing that Mark will include that Matthew does not is a description of Jesus's motive, saying in verse 48 toward the end, he meant to pass by them. But in verse 49, when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. What Mark does not include is the famous passage of Jesus encouraging them by allowing Peter to walk on the water or walk out to him. Simply including the portion where instead of just passing them by, he gets on the boat and calms the sea. Also letting us know that they still didn't get it even after seeing the loaves and the fishes, because their hearts were hardened. As much like we saw in Matthew 14, the last section here will go from verses 53 through, 56, maybe 57, I think it's just verse 56, describing the way in which once they crossed over and entered into a place called Gennesaret, or the land at Gennesaret, they moored ashore, and people once again recognizing Him and the apostles began to bring sick people to them on their beds wherever they heard he was. And much like the woman who realized that if she could just touch the fringe of his garment, that she would be healed, likewise, many were healed. Quite possibly, not necessarily, doesn't literally say at her influence, but understand that these stories were spreading, and that's the reason why these crowds were coming to him. Quite possibly understanding what was now possible. All we know is that like she was healed by touching the fringe of his garment, many were healed by touching the fringe of his garment here. With this story and the feeding of the 5,000 reminding me of probably what stood out to me most in this chapter, and that is the contrast between when to press forward and when to fall back or when to move on. Understanding that even though they seem to have been fatigued before the feeding of the 5,000, they pressed forward in compassion for the crowds. It's literally going to say because of Jesus's compassion for the crowds. Likewise here, when they get to the other side of the sea and they're pressed again, when people recognize them, they push forward, seemingly out of compassion for the crowds. However, that's an interesting contrast to Jesus's commands to them on what I have called a great mission. Understanding the famous order, shake the dust off of your feet in situations where the towns will not listen to you. It's so similar to what I saw in what eventually ended up becoming a point of contention for John, and that is the resistance to basic truth. The basic truth that, bro, you cannot be married to your brother's wife. That's not okay. And so understanding that the times in which Jesus tells them to essentially shake the dust off of their feet is an interesting contrast to the way the chapter ends up with the great compassion. Understanding that they are already drained from their journey, taking on the additional burden of trying to spend too much time in a situation where basic truth is off limits is not a burden that God puts on his apostles. And that is super important for us to understand, I think, in our own lives. As we from time to time notice the way in which counselors get paid the big bucks to, among other things, help us understand how to set healthy boundaries to keep us from becoming burnt out. Which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please help us not to overlook the way in which you have already given us in your word wisdom as to how we can effectively set healthy boundaries, God willing, as a foundation for you guiding us even more into greater wisdom as to how we can keep from becoming burnt out.